Once upon a time, in a grand and beautiful estate, lived a father with a strong sense of responsibility and his children. One of them was George Washington, the legendary figure who would one day be called the father of the nation. At that time, young George was just a curious and lively boy, fascinated by the world around him, especially a small axe in his possession. This little axe, shiny and sharp, was a birthday gift from his father. On the day he received the axe, George could hardly contain his excitement. He held it in his hand, admiring its gleaming blade, thinking of all the fun he could have with it. He thought about making a wooden sword or carving some decorations to show his friends. Yet, these thoughts quickly passed as George eagerly set out to find a piece of wood that would suit his creative plans. As George wandered through the estate's courtyard, he spotted a small, slender sapling. It didn't stand out much, weak and thin, with sparse leaves stretching toward the sky as if reaching for the sun's warmth. Passing by, George thought of an idea. The tree looked just right for making his wooden sword. Without hesitation, he took up his axe and began to chop. Chop, chop, went the little axe, and soon George had cut a small branch, satisfied that he could now make his creation, discovery of the truth, George happily crafted his wooden sword, proud of his work. He waved it around, imagining himself as a noble knight. But as evening fell, the family gathered in the warmly lit hall, where his father sat at the table, looking serious. On the floor lay a few broken branches, and a tense silence filled the room. Who chopped down the cherry tree? His father's voice was calm but held a note of seriousness. George's heart sank. He suddenly realized that the small tree he had cut was the estate's precious cherry tree. This sapling was something his father had transplanted from afar, and it was both rare and beloved. George remembered that his father had warned them many times to leave the cherry tree untouched. George froze, his heart filled with worry and regret. He recalled his father's lessons on responsibility, but at that moment, he felt unsure of what to do. The other children shook their heads, each insisting they hadn't touched the cherry tree. George stood there, too afraid to speak, feeling a heavy guilt in his heart, responsibility and choice. Just then, the gardener's young son, who was in the room, started to cry softly. In those days, gardeners were often held responsible for anything that went wrong on the estate, and the boy was scared his family would be dismissed because of the damaged tree. Seeing the boy's fear, George's heart grew even heavier. He didn't want others to bear the blame for his mistake. His father looked at each of the children, then began to reassure the gardener's son, calming him down. At that moment, George took a deep breath, stepped forward with his face flushed, and found the courage to speak. "Father, I'm sorry. I was the one who chopped down the cherry tree," George admitted, his voice quiet but determined. "I didn't realize it was so special and only wanted to make a wooden sword. It was wrong of me, and I'll accept any punishment, but please don't make them leave." His father's expression softened, and he sighed as he placed a gentle hand on George's shoulder. "I'm proud of you for being brave enough to take responsibility. Honesty is one of the most important virtues. When we're honest, we learn from our mistakes and grow stronger." Making amends then, his father asked, "How do you plan to make up for your mistake?" After thinking carefully, George answered, "I'll help the gardener clean up the estate and plant a new tree where the cherry tree once stood. I know I can't bring back the original tree, but I want to show that I am truly sorry through my actions." His father nodded, smiling with pride. "Remember, my child, everyone makes mistakes, but what matters is how we grow from them. Owning up to them, as you did, is a mark of true courage and will serve you well in the future." The warmth of family and growing up. From that day on, George worked beside the gardener every day, keeping his promise. He not only helped plant a new sapling but also learned about gardening, how to care for plants, water them, and fertilize the soil. Through this work, he not only made up for his mistake but also formed stronger bonds with his family and the gardener's family. His siblings saw his efforts and started to learn from him, understanding the importance of responsibility. The family praised George, admiring his honesty and courage. Although he rarely mentioned the cherry tree incident, George knew that it had shaped him in a meaningful way. He learned the true meaning of honesty and courage and grew to value the relationships around him more deeply. George's growth and future responsibility. Years later, George grew up to become the first president of the United States. Throughout his life, he remained honest and courageous, serving the country with a strong sense of responsibility. His determination to do the right thing didn't just affect his family, it extended to the entire nation. As he led the young country, he set an example for others, becoming a role model for his people. He always remembered the cherry tree and the courage it took to admit his mistake. During difficult times, George would recall his father's lesson, reminding himself of the importance of honesty and responsibility. These virtues shaped him into one of the greatest leaders in American history, admired by many generations. A legacy of honesty and responsibility. Dear children, when we face challenges or difficult decisions, remember George's courage and honesty. As we grow, we may make mistakes, but the key is to take responsibility and have the determination to make things right. Each mistake can be a chance to grow, and with effort and care, we can become stronger and better people. So let's keep the story of George Washington close to our hearts, learning from his example to hold honesty and responsibility as lifelong principles. See you next time, little friends. Do you still like today's story? If you like, please remember to subscribe to this channel and click the like icon. You can receive notifications and hear the latest stories as soon as possible. Good night, my baby.